Hello everybody, this is David, and I am going to do a podcast on more advanced sine wave expressions. So, anyone that has done rigging is probably familiar, at least in some way, of sine wave expressions and what they do, essentially giving you a continuous motion in a wave patterns that can be used for things like wings or tails or tentacles or anything that would have a large number of joints controlling it. And just to show you what the finished product looks like, I'm going to run the expression so you can see it running nicely. All different animations, but all generally the same speed. But the values can be adjusted here, so I can decrease the strength of it, make it stronger. I can increase the speed. I can change the delay, so I can have these moving consistently, or give a little bit of overlap to the animation, or the more I increase it, the more of a wave pattern I get out of each tentacle. And Autodesk has some information on sine waves and how to get them to work in an expression, but the documentation is very limited as far as what you can do. It can give you the basics, but it can't get you to this level. And unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of documentation on how to do this, and I will go into I'll go into the math and how to create that expression. Let me just show you a little bit of the extra. So here's the offset, so I can change whether the tentacles move continuously as a whole or giving some variation to the tentacles so that they move differently, so it's a little bit more organic. And there's a fall off, so I can actually control at what point for the tentacles they move, so I can stop them and I can bring them back so that the whole tentacle moves. And there are attributes to control each rotation of the tentacle, so I can control X, Y, and Z as it moves. Now the actual math for this expression I have right here. The information where I got most of this from was from a Vimeo video by Suchan. It's called a procedural chain setup, and he's where I got most of the math from, but I've made some changes to it to make it a little bit more workable and easy to use, and just add a couple features here and there. So the actual expression that I use is right here. So the first thing you do is you create a series of variables. So I have variables to control the X, Y, and Z rotations. I have multiplied it by 0.1 just because most variables I do go from 0 to 10. So an on-off is typically 0 to 1. So I just take the 0 to 10 and multiply it by 0.1. So the max is actually 1. I have a variable for the float, or I mean variable for the fall off. And what this actually does is it controls, as you saw, where the rotations stop on the tentacle, and as I move the attribute up, more of the tentacle stops moving. And so here's the 0 to 10 attribute, and it's multiplied by the number of joints times 0.1. And the reason I do that is, all joint chains come in different numbers, and if, let's say, the joint chain has 15 joints, I want the fall off to, when it finally reaches 10, to hit the 15th joint. And if the attribute still has a max of 10, then the attribute will stop at 10, and I won't get the remaining 5 joints in a 15 joint chain. So I multiply the attribute times the number of joints times 0.1. So if there's 15 joints, this would be 1.5. And so the max attribute would be 10 times 1.5, which is 15. So this just allows me to convert a 0 to 10 attribute to the number of joints that I need. And I have the amplitude. And the amplitude, if you can tell here, I've multiplied it essentially by itself. The original code that Suchan had he had two amplitude attributes, a start amplitude and an end amplitude. And I just combined the two because they both really did the exact same thing. If you just flip the values, the joint chain moved exactly the same, so there really wasn't that much of a difference. So I just essentially combined them into one attribute. And I multiplied it by the fall-off number, or by the fall-off attribute. Take that one out. I multiplied it by the fall-off variable because as the fall-off attribute keeps increasing, the problem is it decreases the overall amplitude of the sine wave expression. So I essentially kind of hack it so that as the fall off increases, it also multiplies the amplitude. So it allows me to have the amplitude stay strong even though the fall off is decreasing the overall amplitude. And so I also have attributes for, or variables for speed and delay and offset. Now the delay is what gives us that nice overlapping animation, and I multiplied by -5 because in the original video for Suchan, he didn't have any limits on his the attributes on the icon. So at a certain point, as you keep increasing the delay attribute, the animation just starts to, the delay starts to just cycle. And it goes from having no delay to a lot of delay, and as you keep increasing, it goes back to having no delay. So I just gave the attribute max of 10 and multiplied it by this number, just so when the delay is at its absolute max, or when the delay attribute is at its absolute max, there is no increasing delay, and it doesn't go back to basically having no delay. And the offset is so I can move, you can adjust where the sine wave animation is. So you can push it further or move it back. And this you really only need if you have multiple appendages. So in this case of the tentacles, there's a lot more than one of them, and I don't want them all to be moving at the exact same animation. So having the offset allows me to adjust the animation of each of these tentacles so that they're not all moving at in the exact same motion, which makes it look a little bit more organic. And so if we come down here, we can see the actual expression. Now I only have it for the first joint. Obviously you would need to repeat these lines of code for each new joint that you create, or each joint in the joint chain. So I'm not going to go through every single step of the expression, but just overall the basis of what I'm doing. So this is just a simple sine wave over time, so the time of the timeline. It's multiplied by the frequency to make it faster or slower. The offset is added just to adjust the animation, and it's added by the math here, which essentially creates the delay. And what it does is it increases the delay with each joint. So for the first joint, there really isn't any delay, but the second joint will have a little bit more delay, and the third joint will have a little bit more delay, and it keeps going. And one thing I changed in here, oh, and before I go into that, I'll explain words like this, like joint adjust and joint number and joint total. So the joint adjust is essentially the total or the number of joints plus 1. And the reason I do that is basically through this math, it takes the joint number and subtracts 1 to it. And if you have the actual joint number and you subtract 1, so if this was the first joint and I subtract 1, that gives me 0. And if you multiply anything by 0, it's automatically 0. So we add 1 to this number, so if you subtract 2 minus 1, you get 1, and so you can start from there. And the only difference between the original code from Suchan and the one I have here is I used a clamp node, or I used a clamp. And this is how I create the fall off. So for each joint, I have a clamp, and the minimum is 0, and the maximum is the actual joint number. So what this allows me to do is, as I move the attribute up, it reaches the joint number and then stops. So in this case, since the joint number is 1, if I move the fall off attribute up, this will be the joint adjustment number, which is 2, minus 1, and then minus 1. So it creates the 0 number, which stops the animation, which is how I create that fall off, so the tentacle stops as it keeps going. And then it takes, moving on to the rest of the expression, this multiplies the amplitude by the same overall math as I had done before, and it's just the same math. It's the same math as we did for the delay applied to the amplitude. So with each incrementing joint in the chain, the amplitude gets larger and larger. And through the end of it, it gets multiplied by essentially an on-off attribute, which is this xval, which is just turning which axis of rotation you want on or off. And so you have one of those for each joint rotation axis. And I forgot to explain. The joint total is essentially the total number of joints times 2. This is just an arbitrary number that you use to create the proper math. Suchan explained that it didn't actually have to be the exact total number of joints times 2. It can be a little bit more, but just as long as it's at a minimum the joint total times 2. It's just something to help the math function correctly. And with that, we can start plugging all of that into a fresh animation. So I'm just going to create a quick joint chain. 2, 3. Let's stop there. So we've got these joints. I'm going to rename these real quick. So let's do tail 1. Actually, let me pull up my handy dandy script real quick. I can rename these really quick. CT tail. Again. Alright, so now we have our joint chain named. Obviously, you would have to do that yourself, but because I have that tool, I can do it much faster. So I have the joint chain here. I'm just going to create just an icon, just to have it, and then just call this tail icon. Okay. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is build the attributes, and since that's going to take a while, I'll just fast forward to that point. Alright, and we're back. So as you can see, we've built all the attributes that we're going to need. I didn't want to have to go through actually building them all in front of you, so I'll just explain the min and max values for each. So the on-off attributes for each rotation axis are -10 to 10, so they can change direction. Strength and speed are 0 to 10. Delay is 10 to -10, because you want the ability for the delay to go in different directions. You have the animation offset going from -10 to 10, and the fall off is just a regular 0 to 10. So now that we've got the attribute set, we can actually go ahead and make the expression. So we'll open the expression editor. Sure, we're selecting by expression name. I'll just call this tail expression. Let's go get our code. So we've got this. I don't need this down here because this is really only just notes for what everything is in here. And I'm going to just increase the font size so it'll come in the right size in the expression editor. So now that we've got the code in here, now we just need to replace the keywords with the actual numbers. So since we're talking about joint 1, I'll just replace this with the actual joint 1 name. And we'll also take the tail icon and replace that icon name keyword up here. And I just need that one right there. Okay, so first things first is we need to replace the joint adjustment number. And remember, the joint adjustment number is the joint number plus 1. So that's going to be 2. Let's keep going until we find some more. Alright, there's our joint adjustment number. Joint adjust. Okay, and then the joint number is the actual joint number, so in this case that is 1. Oops. Yep. And the joint total is, if you remember, is the number of joints times 2. In this case, how many bind joints do we have? We have 17 bind joints. So times 2 is 34. Let's keep going through. So 34. 34. Okay, so we've replaced all the keywords. So we should be able to hit create. And I missed a joint number somewhere. Oh, up here. So in this case, the joint number is 17. So times 0.1 is 1.7. So I'm just going to do that. So I hit create. And so we know that the code is working. Now, obviously, we've only done the code just for the first joint. So we would need to do it for every joint after that. So I'm just going to skip ahead until we have the code ready for all of the joints, not just the first one. Alrighty, and we're back. So at this point, I have included the code for all the joints, all the bind joints in the system, so up to joint 17. And you see the joint numbers have been set to correspond to the right joints. The joint total numbers are fixed. Everything should be set. The expression is set. So now we can test it to make sure that it works. So let's start just turning it on. Let's increase the strength and the speed. Now we should start to see some actual movement here. Be a little fast. There we go. And let's start pushing the delay so we get some nice fall off. Now we're starting to see that sine wave the way we want it to see it. I can adjust the animation however I want, and the fall off, and cut off the rotation. And that's pretty much it. You know, the code can be very easily scriptable, so you can create it just with the click of a button. And that's pretty much it. So, hope you enjoyed the video.